All right. Well, some of you guys may have seen my presentation a few weeks back where I talked about my net farm income estimates for this year and last year. And, again, a lot has to happen before that actually occurs. Namely, I think we need a lot of rainfall kind of going forward at this point. But, if we do kind of get good weather or normal weather anyway for rainfall, I think we have some really potential to have some really good net farm income. The flip side of that, though, besides the fact we have good prices, is what's going to happen on the expense side. So that's what I'm going to kind of focus on today is what do some of our major expenses look like going forward? And Jenny was right. I think we do look at a potential big increase in a lot of our expenses, although I don't think all that's going to hit farmers this year because things like fertilizer and fuel are going up a lot right now as we speak, probably going up today even possibly. But farmers put a lot of fertilizer on last fall, and they probably bought some of their fuel last fall too, which would tend to think that they're not going to see the full effects of those price increases probably till we get to the 2022 year. That's just is my thinking going forward. I saw when I went back, I'm from Illinois too. I'm from the southern part of Illinois though. I went back and saw my mom over Thanksgiving, and I probably saw more fertilizer being applied on that trip from here to Illinois than I think I ever had before during that time of year. It was just incredible how much fertilizer was being applied. So, assuming my anecdotal evidence applies nationally, I think all farmers spent a lot of their money on fertilizer last fall, which is actually a good thing for them. Well, one of the things I wanted to do with, first of all, and some of you may have seen my ag manager paper about this, was looking at where actually farmers actually spend their expense dollar. And certainly farming is not an inexpensive business, because if you look at our KFMA grain farms from last year, our average farm expenses was about close to $600,000 per farm. So that's not pocket change for most folks to get a crop out. So what I did was, from this particular graph, was I went and took our whole farm analysis summaries. I focus only on the grain farms because even though the categories don't change, if you start including a lot of livestock farms, it would change kind of the percentage breakdown. So this kind of allows me to focus on the categories I kind of want to focus on at the moment here. And again, probably most of our farms in our KFMA program are grain farms anyway. So I think this was probably a fair comparison to look at. Took all those categories from all the expense items and then broke them off on a percentage basis. So the one nice thing about doing analysis this way is this is right now is just kind of a whole farm summary for all farms, but eventually I'm going to go through and look at this kind of on an individual perspective and look at things like farm size and maybe tillage method to see if the percents of expenses change as I look at those different breakout of things. So when I'm looking at this on a whole farm basis, then this is an accrual counting method for accounting, which means your expenses are recognized as an expense when you use it, as opposed to cash accounting when the expense is recognized actually when you pay for it. And the other difference that would show up here too, and which I really like about our KFMA analysis, is that we don't use tax depreciation when we report net farm income, although we do keep track of the tax depreciation as well here. So what we're doing is we're using economic depreciation. The KFMA has a formula they use. They try to match the decline in asset value back to what's actually happening in real life. Again, it's not a perfect method, but it's certainly a lot closer way of matching the asset value to what the real asset value is. Although again, there's going to be some discrepancies, but the biggest takeaway from that is that when we use KFMA, their depreciation method here in the whole farm analysis is that it's a much slower rate than what the maker's depreciation methods are. So it does have some basis to reality that reflects the actual decline in values. So if you look at this, again, we have data going back earlier than this, but this was really kind of the first year where I had some good data. If I go back a little bit earlier than this, we have about 4 or 5 more years in our database. But some of my expense items dropped out, even though I knew we had those here. So I kind of trust the data from 77 forward. One thing to keep in mind, though, is some of these earlier years, there's probably still a little problematic with some of these farms of getting everything recorded correctly. I trust our data from the last 10 years a lot. I do more than I trust our data from really the first 10 years in the program here. But even so, I still probably have 44 years worth of data here. So a pretty good data set to look at here. And during this time frame, we've also have changed a lot of our farming practices over time. So we went from a case where we did a lot of mechanical tillage to now we're doing more no-till farming. We're using herbicides as a replacement. There's been big changes in the seed and herbicide technologies that are being used. So a whole lot of things have happened during this 40-year time frame. The one thing that was a little bit surprising to me, though, is that how much machinery has still remained such a big part of most farmers' farm expenses when you look at them as a percent of the whole here. So going back to 1977, you see that machinery was about 40% of total expenses, and it has declined some, but it's still about 30% of expenses, even though now we have a lot more no-till operations. I'm guessing that probably means we have much fewer trips across a farm field. I was talking this with Kevin Herbal about what might explain some of this is, and his idea was that, farmers, when they probably switched to no-till, probably took that opportunity to buy better quality equipment that would do a more accurate job of planting. That maybe they bought a sprayer, which they didn't have before. So all those things contribute to being the fact that the expense items for machinery are still a pretty significant portion, and are the biggest portion for most farms across Kansas. And the other issue too, obviously, is farm machinery has got a lot more expensive too here. So I'm sure that weighs into the consideration of expenses as well here. Then some of our other major categories you see, fertilizer is a big category. Certainly, as we has changed crop mix, I think is causing some of this as we move away from wheat and more toward corn and soybeans, especially corn and sorghum as well, where we have to apply more nitrogen fertilizers. That's part of making this bigger here too. And then during these years right here, from about 2010, we had some pretty high fertilizer prices too, so it became a bigger chunk of our expenses here as well. And then going right along with that, seed, that has been one of the categories that has increased the most. That's from a percentage basis. It was probably about 5% back here in the 70s. It's about probably 13 or 14% now. And as you guys who have bought seed recently, that you can probably testify to seeing that happening in real life too. So this reflects not only the seed cost, but there's more technologies in seed now too. All the GMO seeds that allow us to apply certain herbicides that we couldn't have before. All that's being built into our seed prices that you see here. Kind of same thing with herbicides too. Now we have herbicides that can control specific things. And again, as we move to a switch to no-till, now we move to a herbicide weed control as to opposing to a mechanical weed control. So that's contributing to the bump up in a percent of expenses that you see here too. Here's one thing I kind of want to talk a little bit about, interest as a percent of farm expenses. So if you look at currently what's happening here with thanks to real low interest rates, our interest cost is really only about 4 or 5% of total farm expenses. So not a big deal here. Something to keep in mind though, if we ever get into a situation where we have really high interest rates again, and I don't want to be pessimistic, but I see that happening somewhere in the future, maybe not too distant future, where we're going to be back to having high inflation and interest rates again. Notice what happened back here in the late 70s, early 80s with interest costs when we had double-digit interest rates. Interest expense was about 15% of most total farm expenses. That's a pretty good chunk of your money just going to pay interest costs. The same thing would happen if we ended up with double-digit inflation rates here, or double-digit interest rates here again. I think you would easily see interest rates go up to 1% like you see here, no matter really what farmers do with their total amount of debt here. So keep that in mind here. It's a low expense now, but that's something to watch out for. That could become a much bigger deal going forward. Labor, surprisingly, actually has stayed fairly consistent all the way across time. You would think it might be a little higher percent here, but it's not a whole lot more than what it is presently. It stays around probably 3 or 4% of our total farm expenses. Crop insurance wasn't really added to our database until 1993, so that's why there's really no value you're seeing here before that. I think even though there probably was some cost for crop insurance going back further, but until they made changes to the database in 93, we didn't keep track of it separately right here. So that's what you're seeing as a percent of expenses here. Again, not too big of a deal for most farms. It's total as the comparison to total farm expenses. Cash rent has kind of stayed fairly steady, maybe gone up a little bit though. So cash rent really represents two things. It represents both an increase in the total amount you may be paying for cash rent, but it also reflects the fact that we probably have a lot more acres being cash rented than we did back here in the 70s, where maybe there was more owned land and more share leasing going on here. So that's where our cash rent is representing. And then we have the other category, which is pretty much just everything left over when I took total farm expenses and subtracted out all these other categories. That's what shows up on the other side. Now, again, this machinery thing, it represents several things too. It represents not only the depreciation cost, but also represents fuel, and it represents the repair and maintenance cost. And I have those as a separate slide right here so you can see kind of where that allocation is going here. So here's depreciation cost, which again is economic depreciation, which represents how much the asset declining in value. Here's our repair and maintenance cost. here's our fuel costs, and then other costs, which would kind of be things like custom rates and that kind of stuff. One thing I noticed, though, that there seems to be an inverse relationship between repair cost and depreciation costs, which kind of makes sense. So the more depreciation you have would indicate to me you have newer equipment, which you're going to be taking more depreciation, even using economic depreciation, which should correspond to the fact that if you have newer equipment, you're going to have lower repair and maintenance costs. And we do see that inverse relationship show up when I actually run a formal analysis on this, is that there is an inverse relationship. And then when depreciation goes up, repair and maintenance expenses tend to go down a little bit. Another way of kind of looking at these inputs is looking at these things as an index. And again, this is based on USDA numbers. And really how you view these things really depends upon your time frame and where you actually look at this from a starting point. So if you look at my graph on the right, where I'm looking at my 2015 as my starting point, you can see I have my my CPI index, and you can see most of these categories then are actually are probably less than the inflation rate. So you got things like seeds that went down a little bit. Here's our fertilizer, fuels up here, and machinery kind of has followed along with what the inflation index has been. But again, this is from a 2015 perspective. I think you get a better idea going back further, going back 21 years, and look what happened from your starting point of the year 2000. And here's what's kind of a little bit depressing to me is when you compare all of our expenses to what the inflation rate is, practically every single expense category except for herbicides has been above the inflation index, right? So that's kind of a discouraging thing to me, is that, you know, it's kind of it seems to be like a long-term losing strategy to farm because everything's going up higher than what the inflation rate is. And as I was putting this graph together, one thing that stuck out to me was this whole idea of machinery here. So it kind of follows along, and then it suddenly takes a big increase and it kind of follows along again. So I always hear farmers complain about this, that whenever farmers are having a good year, you know, all these input suppliers take that opportunity in good years to jack up their prices and pass those on to farmers, and then they never come back down. I think there's some evidence to actually support that, especially look at the machinery side. There were some pretty good farm years right in here from about, you know, 2010 to 2014, where farm income was really high, and you can see what happened to our index for machinery. It jumped up quite a bit higher. So that's to me is an indication of times machinery manufacturers decided to really raise up prices, and then they never did really come back down. They did slow down and kind of match to the general inflation rate, but they did take those good years to really raise prices. So if we're looking at, you know, really a potentially good net farm income this year, I think you might see this year as a year machinery manufacturers are going to take that opportunity and raise up the input prices again for things like tractors and combines and such. So something to keep an eye on. I think I do have enough data. I can test that a little bit and see if what farmers' perspective is about input suppliers is actually true or not. And then looking at some other things. So with the expenses that farmers pay, a lot of things go into are determined by the oil price, because it affects not only the diesel fuel price, but also fertilizer prices. I have a couple Ag Manager articles talking about this. Here's what the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, was saying about what they thought oil prices was going to happen for the next couple of years. They were predicting oil prices right around $50 a barrel. Well, we're way above that right now. I think we're well above 60 right now. I wouldn't be surprised if we got oil prices up to about $75 by summertime. You can see they kind of covered themselves by putting a very wide range on their what prices could be for the coming year or two. So I think right now we're kind of filing more toward the top end of this prediction right now. Well, what does that mean if you take oil price and apply that back to what the diesel fuel price and gasoline price would say? Well, an oil price of $75 would mean that you would be paying a road diesel price of about $3.40, which means you're probably getting in the range of $3 for a farm price. And it also means you're probably going to be paying $3 a gallon to fill up your gas tank for your car too, which if you guys have been keeping an eye on the gas price, it's kind of hard to ignore. But, you know, here around Manhattan, you know, we're paying close to probably about $2.60 a gallon here. So, you know, $3 gasoline to me this summer is very, very possible. usually because when you consider the fact too that gas tends to top out in prices during the summertime. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised if gasoline prices were $3 come summertime. What is this going to do to the fertilizer price? I think I had the only model out there that actually bases the fertilizer price on the price of oil and the price of corn, as opposed to using the natural gas price. And it turns out to be a pretty good model here. I did this exercise a couple of years ago, went back and revisited my model. My model hasn't changed a whole lot. And based on what I'm seeing, I'm predicting at a bare minimum, I think we're going to see anhydrous ammonia nationally probably approach $600. I would not be a bit surprised if nationally anhydrous ammonia prices, maybe approach $700 before the summer is over here, before they maybe start to tail off in the fall based on what the corn price is showing here. So luckily farmers, I think, have applied and paid for a lot of their fertilizer last fall for this year. But again, going forward into 2022, I think there's a good chance we're going to see some significant increases in fertilizer prices for the following year. All right, some tools to predict or help producers. I have a couple of tools that I've developed. Some of you guys may have seen because you're an ag manager, and you can take a look at. Let me stop sharing this screen and switch over to a different screen here. So here's one of the tools that Terry Griffin and I have. It's a machinery cost calculator. It's meant to supplement our custom rate tool, which it has fine numbers in it. But remember, most producers own most of their equipment, at least based on what our KFMA numbers show us. So this tool will actually help you calculate the cost per acre of using your own equipment to do something on your field. And the nice thing about this tool is it will break it off into the depreciation and capital recovery, as well as the fuel costs and labor costs and such. So and again, this is available as an app, which is really just a kind of an application wrapped around a database, but it functions just like a standalone app would too for Windows. So when you first download this tool and load it up, you'll come to a welcome screen. There's also directions built into this tool too that tell you how to use it. And there's really two main screens you can use with this thing, depending upon what you want to do. If you just want to get an idea of what your cost combinations are for something, you would probably go to this screen right here. The nice thing about this particular screen is you don't mess up the database if you stay in this screen, because any changes you make won't show up in the underlying databases, whereas the other screen allows you to do that kind of stuff and change things in the underlying databases. But the way it starts is you first have to select an implement, and then it matches it up with a power unit, and then it will give you a cost per acre. So let's look at a harvesting operation. And we are going to use, now again, with the combine, you first have to pick the header, and then it matches it up with actually the power unit that goes along with that. So let's pick a corn header. Then we'll ask us for a size. And let's say we're going to use a 6-row 30-inch corn head. You can see it has a matching power unit, which is a combine. I'm not sure what class this would be, but a combine with 250 to 300 horsepower. You have the option here to override that if you don't think that's the right combination for that by picking one of these other power units. And then some operations will have an extra labor involved, and those are turned on by default. You can add those if you want to, but the program doesn't think you need any extra operators with a combine. And then here's what the cost for using a combine as a 6-row corn header. So with a 6-row corn head traveling at standard harvesting speeds, we're going to cover about 5.9 acres per hour. Here's our labor cost is $3.63 per acre. Fuel cost, repair and maintenance, fixed cost, which is, again, that's going to be our depreciation, as well as the interest cost to actually tie that amount of money up, close to $30 per acre. So in effect, when we get done, then we get a harvesting cost of about $49 per acre. And then we probably want to match that up with a grain cart too. So let's go ahead and add a grain cart. Let's say we have a 700 bushel grain cart, and you need about 180 to 190 horsepower tractor to pull that grain cart with. Because grain carts really don't have a field rate per hour, but we typically think you're going to operate a grain cart pretty much nonstop as you run a combine here. It leaves the acres hour blank because you got to fill that in with whatever your combine is doing. So we know our combine is doing 5.87 here. So if I type that in, like that. Now we have the grain cart matched up to the combine and they're operating at the same time frame. That grain cart's going to cost us $21 per acre. So when we look at these two things as a harvest operation together, it's going to cost us about $70 per acre to operate our combine and grain cart in combination here. So now you can see why when I showed you that 30% of farm expenses from machinery, this is why here. And again, a lot of it is coming from this fixed cost side to cover the cost of paying a lot of money to buy red or green paint on your farm. All right, so you can make changes here, and again, it won't affect the underlying database. Now, if you really want to get in depth with your machinery cost calculator, you can come over to this section of the tool, and now you can do things like you can looking at different harvesters here. Here's the thing we were just looking at, a 6-row 30-inch corn head. You can see all the things that go into that. We're assuming that we're driving at a speed of 3.8 miles per hour. We have an 85% field efficiency. Here's our repair and maintenance rates. And again, you can change these if you don't like how these particular things match up to what the combine that you're using. Our defaults basically come back to using the ag engineers formulas for determining cost of production for machinery stuff. So that's where that comes from. And here's the matching equipment that goes along with that. If you change the match here, you will change that permanently in the database. So be careful if you do that kind of thing, if you change something on this particular page, because that will affect all futures of the use of this tool. Now, what I tell farmers, if you really make a mistake and you don't know what it was before and you want to change it back, just download yourself a new version of this tool off Ag Manager, and you can kind of start over again from scratch from that. So again, this allows you to play with some things here by looking at different power units that go along with that. And you can even add new machinery here too. If you got something that we don't have in our database, this allows you to add that to our particular tool here as well. So again, this is our machinery cost tool that's available on Ag Manager. And then let me show you one more tool then about putting together budgets. And this is kind of a new thing that I've developed that hasn't been available. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. All right, here we go. So before we always put together our, yeah, okay, it wouldn't show me the right screen on my computer. All right, so before we want to put together our budgets out as printed PDF copies and also as an Excel file, well, that Excel file was getting very problematic for me to update. It becoming such large and a complicated tool that it become very brittle. So it didn't take much to break it at all. As long as you followed everything precisely as laid out in the directions, it would work fine. But as soon as you variated from that, it would come crashing to a halt. And I was getting more and more phone calls about that. So I went back and basically reinvented our budgeting tool as an application now. This is actually what I was kind of using in the back end before anyway here. So this tool is much more flexible. I got some ideas for how I can do things with this in the future. It gives me a strong back end for building things. And I think I could even do some whole farm planning things with this particular thing. But this is the place to come if you want to take our crop budgets and really do some in-depth analysis of things and make some changes to match your particular farm. This is the tool to do it. All the basic budgets that we print are right here built into our budgeting tool. So you can basically just go to this drop-down menu and pick the one that's of interest to you here. So, and right now I have irrigated corn for north central Kansas as my budget that I'm looking at. You can see here's the background information. It has what our price of diesel and natural gas is, and some other things that go onto the top of most of those budget pages. And then you see it has tabs for the different things you can do with the budgets too. So here's the products page, which tells you the outputs that we're getting from an irrigated corn budget. As you might guess, we're getting corn. Here's what our yield is. Again, these are built into the backend database, which I will show you here in a second. Obviously, we need to update prices since we first put this together back at the time frame, and you can do that right here as well. And then we go to the input side, which is pretty much everything except for irrigation and machinery side. So anything like fertilizers, fuel, fertilizer, herbicides, cash rent, seeds, they all show up right here. You basically get these by clicking a category. And then once you click a category, you can add a subcategory if you want to. This is kind of an optional thing to help group your expenses into certain sorting on the budget page. But again, this part's optional. And then once you actually pick your main category, then you have the subcategory of what the different fertilizers are. So here's the different fertilizers that we have. And again, in this case, I have MAP selected. MAP is normally sold on a per ton basis. So, and when we apply those, we normally think about applying those as a per pound unit. So there's a converter that will take care of converting the price per ton, which is the way it is in the database, to actually how you would use it when you apply it. So basically I have a ton to pound converter right here, and that converts my price to a cost per pound as opposed to a cost per ton. Here's our application rate, which you can change, and it calculates the total cost for me. And again, all this will feed into the very back end of things. On the machinery side, I have that machinery cost tool that I had shown you earlier. That is also built into this directly as a separate component of the budget generator. And again, it works pretty much like that one page of the machinery cost tool did. But I also then have also built in the custom rates into the program here as well here. So if you don't like own machinery, or if you have a particular operation that you do use custom rates, you can actually pick it from over here, and it will give you the cost per acre, just like it did earlier here. And then we have an irrigation section. But again, the nice thing about this tool is I can combine sections together here. So I actually have a separate irrigation budget that actually matches up with my corn budget when I actually combine these things together here. And that will actually produce for me an irrigated budget here. So I eventually see this budget combo thing as the ability to do maybe a combination of looking at wheat crop and double crop soybeans. You could even look at it as a way to do a crop rotation where you're looking at maybe 3 different crops. You could look at those together as a budget combo. And then when you have your budgets ready to print, you just come to the report section, and you can either print the detailed version, which is going to be about a 3-page printout, the executive summary, which is, I think, the version most people are probably going to use. And then you have the short abstract, which is a very, very half-page type printout. Let's just look at the executive summary here real quick. And you can see this should look pretty much like our printed budgets look like. You can see our product, all the specific field operations rolled into these subcategories here. The same with the fertilizers. I have rolled these over into just NP and K. And the same thing with all these other categories. And you can see then for irrigation, there's also going to give you this additional information here at the bottom where it tells you basically how much water you're applying and the cost per acre inch to apply that water here. And then you can print these out and have a printout that should match. If you don't make any changes, it should match those printouts that we have up on Ag Manager. And then if you do want to see all the nitty-gritty details that go into a budget, then we have this page right here. And this prints out everything. So this tells you the specific piece of machinery. It tells you the specific chemical that was used, the amounts, and the specific field operations and such. So again, the bottom line number won't be any different, but it does have a lot more detail. So depending upon how much tailoring you want to do is probably will depend on what particular budget you want to look at. Like I said, for most people, I don't know if you really want to look at this much detail all the time. But if you really want to tailor this to your farm, this is probably the place to go and the thing to look at here. So again, this is still a little bit of a work in progress. I think I'm still missing a few budget that I noticed I left out. I think irrigated sorghum, maybe one of them I'm working on right now. I don't have any directions in here yet. But for the most part, it does work. I will eventually make this part of the budget generator available to those folks who want to get into the back end of things. This is where you can make changes to the underlying databases that go into the actual crop budgets. So if you go to things and look at our custom ops, here's all the custom operations. Here's all the different machinery, just like you saw before. Here's our database of inputs, which I'm pulling directly from that agronomy publication about herbicides and insecticide costs. That's what I'm using for this part of it. And then I have some information here about irrigation stuff too. So this is all the back end stuff. Changes you make here will go directly into your budgets and change those. So again, one of the reasons why I haven't quite made this page of it available is because you can change your budgets very quickly and make a lot of changes you didn't really anticipate if you make changes right here. So that's why for right now I only have this front page of things available. So these tools are available on Ag Manager. They're kind of a work in progress, but again, I think I do have a good foundation for looking at things going forward here. So